The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today. Just want to let you know that we'll get started here in a few minutes just to give folks some time to join. Thanks. Thank you for joining today. We'll go ahead and get started. I think people are slowly trickling in, but it's 2 after, so we'll get going now. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm Avalon Bristow, Program Manager at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, MARCO, and Co-Coordinator for MACAN. Today, we're really excited to host several speakers who will present about their work doing ocean acidification action planning. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk about the fact that this is our fourth webinar in our series 4, and coming up, we have our 5th webinar on May 28th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., where we'll talk about the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program National and Mid-Atlantic Research Plans. So we'll hope you'll be able to join us for that, and registration info will be sent shortly. As a reminder, this webinar is going to be recorded, and all recordings are posted on our website at midacan.org. Very quickly, I just want to turn it over to Emily Silva, who coordinates NECAN, the Northeast Coastal Acidification Network, who's partnering with this webinar to say a few words and updates from NECAN. Emily?
Thanks, Avalon. My name is Emily Silva. I'm the coordinator for the Northeast Coastal Acidification Network, like Avalon just said. I just wanted to give you a brief background about NECAN. We were established in 2013 following a growing concern regarding the effects of ocean and coastal acidification in the Northeast. Since then, we've made it our mission to provide ocean and coastal acidification information to a variety of stakeholders to create a region that's prepared to address and adapt to the effects of acidification. We're able to do this through our steering committee and 4 working groups. Those are education and outreach, industry, management and policy, and science. Through regular meetings, the steering committee and working groups are able to establish goals and identify key actions to take to work towards accomplishing our mission. And those actions might include things like hosting workshops and meetings, providing resources, stakeholder outreach, developing communication materials, and participating in webinars like this one. You can find out more information about those activities on our website, necan.org, or through our newsletter, which you can sign up for through that website. Among the speakers today, you're going to hear from Esperanza Stanchoff, who is on our steering committee. She's also the chair of the Education and Outreach Working Group, and she's a member of the Management and Policy Working Group. So we so appreciate opportunities like this one to collaborate with other groups like MACAN and the OA Alliance. So thank you for having us, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Emily. So I'll go ahead and get into our run of show for today. I did want to mention that this webinar has also been planned in partnership with the OA Alliance, and we're very pleased to have Jesse Turner, who's the project manager for the OA Alliance, who's going to be presenting today about an overview of action plans as envisioned by the OA Alliance. So thanks so much, Jesse, for your work in planning this webinar, and we're really excited to hear from you. Following Jesse, we're going to have Cheryl Huber-Jones, who works for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and she's going to talk about the work from the New York State Ocean Acidification Task Force. Following Cheryl, we have Esperanza Stanchoff, as Emily mentioned, who will be talking about the Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership. Following her, we have Nathan Robbins joining us from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, who will be talking about the perspectives and update from the Maine Climate Council. And then finally, we're really pleased to welcome Keisha Santiago Martinez, who is the chair of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, MARCO. She'll be providing some closing comments and talking about the value of regional partnerships and addressing larger concerns like ocean acidification. Following those presentations, which we anticipate will take about 45 minutes, we will open it up for questions and comments. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end for that. Everybody is going to be muted throughout the webinar, but you can ask questions using the question box. So throughout the webinar, please feel free to put your questions in the question box. We're welcoming Anthony Himes, who is a PhD student at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and a Virginia Sea Grant Fellow, who will be collating those questions and moderating the Q&A session at the end. Again, just another reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the MACAN website on the resources page with our previous webinar series. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to welcome Jesse Turner.
There we are. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start slideshow here. Great. Well, hello, and again, my name is Jesse Turner, the project manager for the Ocean Acidification Alliance, and very happy and grateful to be partnering with MACAN and NECAN today on this webinar. And of course, want to take a quick minute just to acknowledge this time of deep uncertainty and transition for everyone, hoping that you, your loved ones, your communities are doing well and weathering this experience as best as possible. And of course, makes us all the more grateful for your time and participation today. Okay, so I'm going to share a little bit more about our origins and work at the Alliance and hopefully help contextualize and frame some of the presentations that you'll hear from the states of New York and Maine later on. So I think many of you know that we were created in 2016 by the 4 West Coast jurisdictions of Washington, California, Oregon, and the province of British Columbia and Canada. And our goal is really to bring together a diversity of governments and non-government actors from across the globe, both to highlight and to encourage and take action on ocean acidification. And so core outcomes of our work really include the advancements of what we call these OA action plans, which of course is the focus of today's webinar, elevating OA and ocean more broadly within international and domestic climate agreements, and then building a diverse coalition calling for actions, including the need to drastically reduce carbon dioxide emissions, the #1 cause of acidification. So today I wanted to give a little bit more background as to why these 4 West Coast jurisdictions decided to launch the Alliance in the first place. Particularly starting in Washington and Oregon, the first states to experience direct impacts of acidification in the early 2000s, when 2 major oyster hatcheries lost about 100% of their oyster larvae. This was due to increased acidification of seawater coming into the hatcheries and limiting the ability of the crop to develop. And some of you might know shellfish is a critical subsistence, ceremonial, and commercial resource for tribes and coastal communities in this area. The estimated total economic contribution of shellfish is about $184 million annually in Washington. Indigenous crab fishery is about approximately $70 million in Oregon. So really it was in response to this direct observed impact that the industry, shellfish growers, tribal governments, state governments really activated early along the West Coast. And that's really an important origin story for our work with the Alliance. And in fact, Washington state government in 2012 created a special panel that was charged with reviewing the best available science and producing a set of recommendations to guide the state's policy response and really help further prioritize projects and investments. And this is notable, of course, because it's really one of the first comprehensive government-led efforts to address OA locally and regionally. And it also allowed the West Coast to quickly activate resources, better coordinate monitoring and research with the express goal of informing response strategies. So what are we asking our Alliance members to do? So as mentioned, we're asking for the creation of these OA action plans by member governments and interested affiliate members that we've really designed to do 5 things. And so the first is to advance scientific understanding. reduce causes and exacerbators of ocean acidification, both atmospheric and land-based, protect the environment and coastal communities from impacts of a changing ocean. This really calls out the adaptation and resiliency building actions and strategies, expanding public awareness, and then of course, sustaining international support for elevating and addressing this problem. So we really, at the Alliance, keep in mind that not all OA action plans are going to have the same framework or structure. Really, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, both for how governments are going to uniquely experience, or communities are going to uniquely experience this issue, let alone respond to it. And so I think you'll hear about that diversity in approach today. Additionally, a big work of the Alliance is the task of implementing recommendations or priority actions over time. So as we'll talk about, and as you will see, many states have actually already pulled together task force or commissions looking at impacts of ocean and coastal acidification. However, it's really that integration of work across other ocean and climate efforts that must be considered as part of a robust implementation strategy. So just a little bit more about what Washington's plan had, that was released in 2012. So specific actions including passage of package of climate policies designed to reduce the state's carbon dioxide emissions, launching and funding Ocean Acidification Research Center at the University of Washington that really serves as an important hub for our state and for our region. Improving the state's understanding of the role that kelp might play in ameliorating local conditions, enhancing wide-scale monitoring with real-time information sharing that really helps collect data and specifically support the shellfish hatchery adaptation practices and strategies. So some of these example strategies include buffering seawater, shell dissolution, or even aeration techniques. And important to know also that the state's plan is really helping state agencies to better evaluate ocean acidification as it relates to their direct authorities. And also wanting to call out that Washington's OA Action Plan did not expressly require legislation, but instead relied on an executive order by the governor to convene what is our Blue Rim Panel. And today, the Marine Resources Advisory Council does rely on some funding from the state legislature every year to convene meetings and fund priority research and projects. So as mentioned, from 2013 to 2016, there was a lot of activity along the West Coast as the OAH Science Panel convened to somewhat replicate the process and questions identified in Washington, but at a much larger scale. And the panel produced a series of recommendations and support products really aimed at resource managers and state governments. Following from that work and in keeping with the Alliance membership commitment, the state of California, the state of Oregon released their action plans in 2018 and 19 respectively. And California's plans included, just to give you some examples, items like conducting a statewide vulnerability assessment to identify risks posed to biological resources, communities, and economies, really with an emphasis on improving social and economic adaptive capacity. Also noting that California's action plan did not rely on legislation to be created. Rather, it was developed within the framework of the Alliance and led by the state's Ocean Protection Council, the state's Ocean Science Trust. That said, several bills or pieces of state legislation did follow in order to support the implementation of some specific actions in the plan. One example would be including funding for a research pilot to examine the role of kelp and seagrass in remediating impacts near shore. Similarly, Oregon's OA Action Plan does build on a 2018 report that they submitted to the legislature. Some examples in Oregon's plan include co-locating oceanographic monitoring alongside existing biological sampling in marine reserves. Of course, this will help leverage and improve the state's existing research. Amending the Department of Fish and Wildlife Shellfish Assessment Team to enhance observations of shellfish and submerged aquatic vegetation. And then even calling out the need to restore and protect water quality throughout the state's estuaries and nearshore habitats. The state has also has considered specific instances where OA and hypoxia may have appropriate listings under the Clean Water Act. So on the East Coast, you can see that there has been much activity has gone in since about 2014. States creating task force or commissions to evaluate the best available science and the potential effects of the ecology on state waters and fisheries. And again, evaluating the impacts and creating recommendations or a process for doing this is really step one. And then as envisioned by the Alliance, the action plan can really help serve as the roadmap for further integrating, accomplishing, funding, and even sustaining those actions over time or those recommendations over time. And a quick acknowledgement about all the great work that our partners, Ocean Foundation, Ocean Conservancy have done to help states examine and set up these comprehensive task force and commissions over the last several years. Great. So in 2019, last year in September, the Alliance convened about 60 representatives from 14 states to share best practices, challenges, key questions they were facing and taking on the issue of ocean and coastal acidification. And because it is a multi-sectoral and really multidisciplined issue, it's relevant to climate mitigation and adaptation, ocean and land management, food security, coastal resilience, aquaculture, and fisheries. And therefore, it's essential that there's really a high level of coordination and communication between ocean and climate experts, scientists, stakeholders, policy implementers, departments, and programs. And that's really our key message here, is that integration across a large network, both state and non-state actors, that is really key to getting at meaningful work in this particular field. And then lastly, just to queue up some of the presentations that will follow, it is our view that really by creating an OA action plan, governments have an increased ability to develop a comprehensive stocktake of regional vulnerabilities and risks, to better understand local variability and trends, to prioritize studies to examine adaptive capacity in critical species and resources, strengthen the ability to improve local management, and finally, but not least importantly, to strengthen funding opportunities for OA-related projects. So with that, I hope that was a helpful intro and primer for these particular set of presentations coming up here from New York and Maine. Very grateful for their partnership, for being members of the Alliance. And with that, I will pass it on to Cheryl to talk about the New York OA Task Force that has really been, I'd say, ongoing since about 2015. So there we go.
Thanks very much, Jessie. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Earth Day. Hoping everyone is healthy and well. My name is Cheryl Huber-Jones, and I am the New York State Ocean Coordinator for the Department of Environmental Conservation's Division of Marine Resources. And I wanted to point out that New York State is also a proud member of the OA Alliance. Today, I will be describing highlights of the New York State Ocean Acidification Monitoring and the structure of our state's Ocean Acidification Task Force and future report. One second. Just trying to advance the slide here. Okay. Hopefully that works a little bit better. Yep, okay, sorry about that. So in 2017, New York State produced one of the first ever state ocean action plans, which contains 4 goals and 61 actions for implementing an integrated, adaptive approach to managing, restoring, and conserving our ocean resources over the next 10 years. Action number 15 specifically addresses the need to monitor ocean acidification and its potential impacts on shellfish and crustaceans. During this time, the state also passed legislation establishing a task force designed to facilitate information discovery and sharing regarding ocean acidification. And this legislation just recently was extended through 2022. The New York Bight had been understudied for decades. Comprehensive carbonate chemistry sampling was only done once every few years in summer on NOAA's East Coast Ocean Acidification cruises, or the ECOA cruises. Surface PCO2 measurements were done on NOAA's Northeast Fisheries Science Center cruises in the spring and the fall. The blue lines indicate points where carbonate chemistry measurements were made historically. And I wanted to point out that this is a screenshot from the Marco portal last year, and since then, this map has been updated to include the New York monitoring track lines as well as Rutgers glider data. In 2018, New York State's DEC engaged Stony Brook University to embark on a project to measure carbonate chemistry seasonally in the New York Bight on the research vessel Seawolf. Surface measurements are taken with a general oceanics PCO2 sensor and a sunburst pH sensor. pH and water samples are taken at depth with CTD casts along the cruise tracks shown at the left. And this is, again, the map that has been added to the Marco portal. The first cruise in the summer of 2018 clearly indicated 3 areas with distinctive PCO2 dynamics. The area shown in blue on the top left panel in the Long Island Sound is an area of lower salinity and higher productivity, resulting in high PCO2 values. In summer, this is a real net source of carbon dioxide to water bodies. The areas in yellow and green are in the Hudson River plume, where salinity is also relatively low, and PCO2 values are a bit higher than the red areas shown further offshore. And these are also saltier areas. We are quantifying the extent to which these areas are net sources and sinks of carbon dioxide seasonally. These figures depict what a slice of the New York Bight looks like along the transect highlighted in red on the left-hand figure. The ship has taken measurements of 5 different variables at many depths along this transect. The upper left panel shows the temperature as red, indicating warm surface waters, and the pink and purple areas representing the mid-Atlantic cold pool near the bottom. It's this figure here. Note that waters with low pH are also located near the bottom in the mid-Atlantic cold pool. And waters with low dissolved oxygen are also co-located with low pH areas inshore. Water samples are still being analyzed to determine aragonite saturation states, the relevant endpoint for shellfish, but waters in the vicinity of much shellfish habitat are potentially undersaturated, as indicated by the low pH values and from other data collected by the ECOA sampling effort. While these monitoring efforts by the state are being conducted, New York State has convened the Ocean Acidification Task Force. The purpose of this task force was defined by the legislature to be twofold. First, to identify the causes and factors contributing to ocean acidification, and second, to evaluate mitigation measures to reduce the impacts of OA on New York State. The purpose of the task force is not solely to assess environmental impacts of OA, but also consider the economic and social well-being of the state from these impacts. The legislation outlines membership of the task force. These task force members make up a broad group of interested parties, including academic, advocacy, industry, and regulatory representatives. The task force has come together for 3 public meetings so far and are currently involved in the development and refinement of the draft New York State Ocean Acidification Task Force report. The task force has determined that the report will not target global or national mitigation measures, but will instead focus on identifying local mitigation efforts that could make measurable improvements to ocean acidification and also coastal acidification in the New York State region and contribute to broader OA reduction efforts. The initial legislation of 2 years was found to not be sufficient enough time to make the task force appointments, gather data, and make recommendations. So last year, the legislation was extended to 2022. To date, 3 public meetings have been held. This year, members are working in smaller subcommittees to synthesize information and write sections of the report. Moving ahead, the plan will likely have a peer review and public comment period. Per the legislation, the task force report is due to the state legislature at the end of 2022. The New York State Task Force report is being modeled after the state of Oregon's Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Action Plan. The report is broken down into 5 pillars that are all vital to addressing the impacts of OA on New York State, and that will inform a complete strategy for OA mitigation. As delineated in the legislation, the task force will identify the factors contributing to OA and will provide a report containing an assessment of the anticipated impacts of ocean and coastal acidification, a review of the existing OA science literature, and recommendations for mitigation, policy standards, statutory actions, and outreach for ocean acidification. And those are actions that the legislature can then implement and make policy on. So I'd like to thank all of the members of the task force staff who've contributed to this effort, as well as to the actual task force members who are volunteering their time to create this important document. For more information on the DEC, the state's Ocean Action Plan, and the task force meeting agendas, minutes, and expert presentations, please see these web pages, and I'm sure that these resources will be made available after the webinar. I'm happy to answer more questions via email, and that will be displayed later on in the webinar for you all to have. So I forgot to put it on this slide. So now I'd like to turn it over to Esperanza. Thank you.
Oops. There. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. And thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this opportunity to share Maine's story from both Nathan and me. This slide represents some of the needs to be considered in developing a state OCA report, and also the regional effort happening in the Northeast with Maine's commission established in 2014. Maine provides an example of a state doing a lot with essentially no financial resources. The message that I would like to convey in this brief presentation is that the constituency of stakeholders for ocean and coastal acidification can be very broad, and there are prominent opportunities for community and non-governmental organizations to truly assist in how state governments confront acidification. In January 2015, the final commission report with recommendations was released, including a recommendation for an OCA council to keep a sustained, coordinated effort on OCA. LD 493 was introduced to create an OCA council to carry out recommendations of the commission, but the legislation failed to gain executive branch support due to lack of staffing and funding. Nonetheless, the process of writing this first report galvanized a diversified community of experts, and ultimately the recommendations of the report were largely adopted by this grassroots MOCA partnership. A stakeholders meeting was held to determine the next steps. There was a surprisingly high number of 34 participants. With Susie Arnold's leadership, the Island Institute, and her organizational efforts, she got us through the first critical year. This partnership is a voluntary organization with a small steering committee with interested and dedicated folks. In January 2017, Ivy Frignoka ably took over the coordinator's position, and as of January 2020, I moved into that role. Our approach was simple. Anyone could join the mailing list. Anyone could join the conferences. Twice annual symposia highlighted research projects in Maine and advances in policy around carbon emissions reductions or management that related to coastal acidification. Gradually, the group grew and gained representation from each of Maine's coastal counties. As other regional and national efforts proceeded, namely the Northeast Coastal Acidification Network, Northeast Regional Ocean Council, OA Information Exchange, and the OA Alliance, as well as state progress on the West Coast, MOCA was able to bring information and insights to a very localized community along the Maine coast. As you heard earlier from Emily, NECAN provides research and monitoring priorities, policy guidance, and education outreach to stakeholders throughout the Northeast. There's some overlap with MOCA, as several of us are involved in both organizations, and we've held at least 8 different OCA events in Maine over the last 4 years, several of those coordinated by NECAN. We held 6 symposia, a webinar update, and 3 meetings from March 2016 to present to provide a forum for OCA in our state, updating the science, looking at remediation strategies and policy, while educating ourselves and others. So in total, we've held or partnered with others to host close to 20 events in Maine over the past 4 years. We held a half-day meeting with the Legislative Caucus, Coastal Caucus, which included 21 legislators, including many newly elected, and several with a marine science background. The consensus of the meeting participants was that MOCA's, or Maine's focus, should shift from solely examining the impacts of OCA on marine organisms to examining more broadly the synergistic impacts of climate change on Maine's marine organisms. The legislators who participated requested that MOCA better define the composition of and vision for an ongoing commission, including its primary goals with respect to better understanding and addressing the broader impacts of climate change. That is, increased predation, increased shell disease, and changing ranges for species in addition to OCA. As the compilation of MOCA meeting notes and our constituency overall gained legitimacy, the group became more and more politically engaged, crafting language for bond bills around monitoring programs, and by helping to create legislative language to strengthen climate commitments in our state, hosting informational panels for legislators and decision makers. And of course, the big news for Maine is that Governor Janet Mills has initiated an ambitious and responsible climate change council to address this and many cross-sectoral issues around climate change. In support of the council's work, we held 3 meetings, one on research and monitoring, one on adaptation and resilience, and another on policy and law. We had approximately 25 expert participants in each session. 2 major reports resulted from this work. Guided by these themes and the input received during the stakeholder sessions, the MOCA Steering Committee recommended that Maine's 2020 Climate Action Plan prioritize specific strategies and 6 actions identified with respect to ocean climate change. The MOCA Supplemental Report was designed for scientific audiences who are new to the topic of ocean and coastal acidification and provides an initial capacity assessment of activities and personnel working on ocean acidification science, monitoring, and conservation efforts in Maine. Essentially, the report aims to connect conceptual goals of mitigation and adaptation for ocean and coastal acidification with current efforts that can be further supported. Most of our steering committee is working on the Maine Climate Council working groups, the Coastal and Marine Working Group, and the Community Resilience Working Group. Currently, our MOCA Steering Committee is working towards a symposium in the fall to provide current research and information connecting to the Maine Climate Council, as well as continuing to support the work of the Council and continuing to keep our 200+ list of interested parties up to date. Resources and meeting information can be found on our website that's hosted by Maine Sea Grant. Thank you for your time, and now I'll pass it on to Nathan.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. My name is Nathan Robbins. I work as the climate change specialist and climate adaptation program manager in the Office of the Commissioner at the Department.
Hey, Nathan, this is Jesse. You're a little bit muted, so maybe whether it's a headset reset or something else.
How's that?
I think better.
Okay, thank you. All right, technology aside, we'll get started here. Let me see if I can. So over the past year, Maine has reemerged as a state seeking to combat climate change though there has been a lot of groundwork laid. We have a legacy of work to build from. In 2004, we developed our climate action plan in response to initial greenhouse gas reduction goals that were put into state law in 2003. In 2009, we had our first impact assessment, the first in a series of reports called the Maine Climate Future, put together by the state's University of Maine and with over 70 different scientists contributing. That updates really led to 2010 legislation, which created our 2010 Maine Adaptation Plan, and then further 2013 legislation to continue study of climate change and impacts and to continue to implement those recommendations. Our latest 2018 update to the State Hazard Mitigation Plan now includes climate change as an underlying factor that exacerbates all of the other natural hazards and prompts near-term work to link resilience and hazard mitigation, to break the disaster recovery cycle, and to incorporate adaptation into planning and projects. And so there's a need now to combine adaptation, preparedness, and our mitigation efforts so we can have one conversation together and across sectors. We're coming into a period where we needed new updated greenhouse gas reduction goals. There was no specific long-term reduction goal defined in statute for beyond 2020. And our 2004 Climate Action Plan only evaluated reduction strategies up to 2020. The Maine Climate Council bill was enacted in 2019, LD 1679, and signed into law in June 26, 2019. It sets new greenhouse gas reduction emissions into state law for 45% by 2030 and 80% by 2050 below 1990 levels, which is the continued annual trajectory to achieve by 2040. The council convened its first meeting in September of 2019, and the council is tasked to advise the governor and legislature on ways to mitigate the causes of, prepare for, and adapt to the consequences of climate change. And they will do this through the development of an updated and unified climate action plan. So the council creates a long-term forum, a place for sustained and integrated conversation with key stakeholders. Over time, a coalition of partners has stewarded the progress and been maintained on climate in various ways across the state. But now we can begin to leverage knowledge we have in Maine and in our networks to broader regional actors. The formal Maine Climate Council is made up of 39 members and co-chaired by the Maine Department of Environmental Protection Commissioner and the Director of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and Future, a newly established office under the Mills administration. In total, there are over 240 people that make up the council and its supporting groups. Members come from a diverse makeup of experts across various sectors, including legislators, representatives, scientific and academic institutions, affected and involved businesses, nonprofit organizations and foundations, youth, and leaders from federal, state, and local governments and agencies. I'm going to focus on just a portion of the work here. The Science and Technical Committee provides the underlying scientific support to the entire Maine Climate Council and all working groups. And working groups provide a deep dive on their topics to develop strategies for both greenhouse gas mitigation and for adaptation, and overall are working towards shared solutions and across sectors. The Science and Technical Subcommittee has formed various subgroups to accomplish their scope of work. That includes to identify, monitor, study, and report relevant data, findings, and recommendations on how climate change is impacting Maine. Those can include ocean. There is a specific group on temperature, sea level rise, and acidification, on ecosystems and biodiversity, on food systems, human health, and economy, and several others. They are highlighting critical scientific data and knowledge gaps. Specifically, they are tasked to establish a science-based sea level rise projection for the state's coastal areas by December 1st of 2020 and update those projections at least every 4 years. Additionally, they need to advise on methodologies and science for land and ocean-based opportunities for carbon sequestration. The STS has created its Phase 1 report, nearly 400 pages produced in January, and now are detailing their efforts further in a Phase 2 report, all of which will be included in the final climate action plan. At the working group level, most have 30 to 40 members and are broken into subcommittees as well that are currently very active in developing recommendation, mitigation, and adaptation strategies. All the groups are also will be soliciting stakeholder input. This has been going on to the council and through its work groups in many ways ongoing, but some targeted engagement is currently being designed, particularly in light of how to meet in person. They also have to consider costs and benefits, including impacts on low income, elderly, and rural residents and other vulnerable communities, advise on economic and workforce benefits and challenges, and recommend funding and financing mechanisms for strategies. These are the broad scopes of work for community resilience and the coast and marine groups, which include things like reducing our carbon footprint of ports and marine transportation, looking at storing carbon, the use of aquaculture and nutrient reduction to mitigate coastal acidification. On the adaptation side, to conserve and restore natural systems, filter pollutants, to protect and conserve marine ecosystems, to adapt emerging fisheries and aquaculture, to update our regulatory and governance tools, including in areas of land use development, and institutionalize adaptive capacity, and prepare infrastructure in vulnerable communities. And there are co-beneficial activities that are being discussed, including one that has emerged across working groups, and specifically to coast and marine and community resilience, to create a robust coastal and marine monitoring network and system. There's efforts to identify the public health impacts and adapt and to mitigate to those, and to put climate education as a lens across all of the work groups. So stepping back a little bit from the council specifically, and to build on what Esperanza was mentioning, climate change and adaptation work in communities in Maine is being facilitated by many different coalitions. Coalitions represent broad-based members with diverse backgrounds. Generally speaking, the desired outcomes of these efforts are that communities are able to implement mitigation and adaptation steps, conducting assessments and participating in research, building capacity to act by increasing knowledge, social, technical, and financial resources, integrating climate into planning, regulation, and policy, and for on-the-ground installations. Implementation is occurring at local level, where land use decisions are made and where hazard mitigation and emergency management services start. At intrastate levels, where regional level coordination is providing examples for neighboring towns and cities, addressing cultural and landscape distinctions and building efficiency through regional research and education. At the state level, efforts to enable local action, reducing barriers to action, providing consistent, actionable guidance, and providing financial, technical, and human resources. And at interstate regional level coordination, which are helping experts and communities learn from each other, build a community of practice, and provide shareable models for policy and implementation that provide scale for relevant research. Members of these various efforts, such as from the Legislative Commission on OA that was detailed already, from MOCA, also discussed, the Gulf of Maine Council, and from another network called the Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network, are all also members of the Maine Climate Council. To quickly cover a bit about CCAP, the organization was formed, or the network was formed in 2010 and focuses really on community resilience needs. It was initially hosted by a meeting of the Maine Coastal Program and UMaine Extension, Maine Sea Grant. It was a start to a conversation on coordination and collaboration on coastal community projects and to share resources. The idea, though, evolved into a network of members initially hosted by Maine Sea Grant and UMaine Extension, and now is co-coordinated with the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. The network holds biannual in-person meetings to continue sharing research, education, and outreach projects and information across members and with host communities. CCAP is made up of nearly 40 organizations, over 70 members, and is continually growing. CCAP draws from a broad-based representation of local, state, and federal government, higher ed, research institutions, and nonprofit organizations, and several consultants, and is strengthened by the diverse backgrounds and expertise of its members as primary research, subject matter experts, facilitators, and planning professionals. And there's a picture of us meeting and discussing a living shoreline project there at the bottom of the slide. So this coalition of partners has been maintained and relationships have been built. That was one of the primary recommendations of our 2010 adaptation plan as well. And so we are seeing in this partnership with MOCA to develop an action plan and hand off with the Maine Climate Council, just one example of that exchange. We know at this early stage already that Within our Community Resilience Work Group, Coastal Marine Group, and STS, there are discussions for drafting strategies for monitoring and acidification and for more comprehensive marine monitoring program. Others discuss for land use development, upland point and non-point source pollution, and for conservation, restoration, and protection of natural systems. And this issue is not new to Maine. State government and engaged organizations at the grassroots level, these issues have garnered of focused attention and elevated coordination. We've learned from our ongoing efforts that the tasks of combating ocean acidification with other impacts of climate change are enormous and that we cannot succeed alone. In some ways, this is not different than our greenhouse gas mitigation efforts to some extent, where we are acting locally and asking for a broader community to act. And so this requires a global effort, and we are ready and willing to join forces with a larger effort. And that's exactly what we did in announcing our membership to join the International Alliance to Combat Ocean and Coastal Acidification in January of this year. Because by joining the OA Alliance, we recognize and endorse this call to action. So to quickly just cover that overlapping these efforts, there are a host of other actions that we have already been taking early on. We've joined the U.S. Climate Alliance. We've increased our new renewable portfolio standard to 80% by 2030 and to 100% by 2050. We've restored net metering. We've launched an electrical vehicle rebate and infrastructure programs, ended the blanket ban on wind power development, set a goal of 100,000 new heat pumps by 2025, withdrew Maine from the Offshore Drilling Coalition, and through an executive order, have put the state on track to achieve a commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, which has now been put into the Climate Council discussions and will be tasked with developing recommendations on how to achieve that as well. So quite a bit happening on the mitigation side already. Realistically, there are several steps between now and any final inclusion of OA into the Climate Action Plan. I've detailed a number of areas that are being discussed, but we can clearly see that they are moving towards integrated discussion of ocean acidification within the Maine Climate Council, including with a connection to community resilience. And so a recommendation to the 2020 Climate Action Plan is possible. Of course, we cannot be sure of what a recommendation would look like, something specific, or several efforts that constitute similar goals or some other option. But we have begun utilizing all of our networks to integrate this into the broader organizational framework. And so we are currently within our strategy development, and from there we will present our climate action plan in December. The legislature and DEP passed legislation to initiate rulemaking based on any of those recommendations. The council and work groups will continue to meet. There is no sunset on the council. The working groups will be tasked with creating annual work plans, and our department will be updating its methodology where we report on greenhouse gas inventory every 2 years to also incorporate how net is included in there. Achieving reduction goals only through gross, but reporting on net as well. So thank you so much, and there's my contact information.
Thanks, Nathan. I'll take over the screen and then pass the mic over to Keisha for some closing remarks.
Great, thank you so much, Avalon. Hi, everyone. I have the esteemed pleasure of representing the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council of the Ocean, MARCO, comprised of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. On behalf of the entire MARCO state, I'd like to thank everyone who presented today about their impressive work on ocean acidification. In particular, I'd like to thank the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program for providing the webinar service and organization support, the OA Alliance for coordinating all the speakers, NECAN for their partnership in delivering the webinar, and finally to everyone in attendance today. Indeed, happy Earth Day. Hope everyone is safe, and a little congratulations to Cheryl Jones. This is New York's DEC's 50th anniversary. Ocean acidification is a global issue, not a local one. Working regionally provides opportunities to learn from one another like we did today. Continuing these events will enhance and accelerate the entire region's ocean acidification action plan effort. Ocean acidification doesn't have an easy solution. Scientists, industry leaders, community leaders, and governments must work together to further knowledge and understanding of this key issue. We must also work together to address its effects through enhanced scientific and policy response cooperation and outreach strategies. Our success will demonstrate the value of developing regional capacity to understand and address other key ocean-related issues, such as changing ocean conditions. I hope that you will all join us for the Ocean Alliance's final webinar in this 4-part series, NOAA Ocean Acidification Research Planning at 11 a.m. on May 28th. And I sincerely want to thank you all for taking the time today and continuing the great work that we're doing. In spite of everything that's going on, it's important that we continue to press forward with this important work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Keisha, and thanks to all of our presenters today. Now I'll turn it over to Anthony Himes to moderate a Q&A. We have about 9 minutes left. So Anthony, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Evelyn. So we do have some questions that have come in. Feel free, if anyone has any last-minute ones, to drop them in the questions box, and I'll ask them to our speaker. Our first question, this came up during your talk, Jesse, but any speaker that has any input on this, feel free to jump in. Do New Jersey or Connecticut have ocean action plans or task forces in place yet, as those states weren't listed on one of your slides?
Sure, the question is Connecticut or New Jersey, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
I won't answer that off the top of my head. I know that New Hampshire had a commission that I did not put on that slide, but I could definitely make that, I'm sure folks can find that, but not to my quick knowledge, but that doesn't mean that they haven't existed.
Hi, everyone. This is Cheryl Jones from New York State. I will say that at the OA workshop that was held back in September, that New York made wonderful connections with folks from both of those states, and they have expressed interest in formulating some sort of plan, and certainly as it applies to bordering water bodies with New York State, would be willing to work with them on that, such as the Long Island Sound in Connecticut, for example.
Okay, our next question is open to everyone. Do any of these states and organizations consider submerged heritage or cultural resources that may be affected by acidification?
Hi, this is Cheryl again. I'll take that. I don't know specifically how that has been addressed in our report, our state's report, but I will find out, and certainly if it's not there, I will recommend that it is there.
Likewise.
This is Jesse. I can say that several alliance members, I can't speak for this state specifically, but other partners throughout the alliance have addressed or referenced that within planning priorities or or different topics. So that has come up, I would say, in the alliance network.
Okay, our next question is, has there been any discussion of states banding together to take regional action on ocean acidification and/or climate change?
So I'll quickly say, for Jesse from the Alliance, that on the West Coast, that is very much the story of even, quite frankly, how the Alliance came to be. I sort of touched on it a little bit by talking about the OAH science panel that was convened between 2013 and 2016. But even including that panel and several other entities like the Pacific Coast Collaborative that brings together the governments of the 4 governments that launched the Alliance, British Columbia and Canada, Washington, Oregon, California, as well as other groups like the West Coast Ocean Alliance. There have been lots of regional coordination on the West Coast, and I think there's a lot of specific reasons for that, including the direct impacts that were experienced that haven't, kind of had the same experience on the East Coast. But it's our point of view that that has been an immeasurable help, and that has really accelerated the ways that individual states could even go so far so quickly in some of their work on this topic. So that's the sort of the West Coast experience, and this was also a topic of discussion at that East Coast, West Coast convening that I mentioned that we had last year. And I think I'll kick it over maybe to Maine or New York to talk about other discussions that have happened either through MARCO or other organizing bodies, climate or ocean or otherwise.
Yeah. This is Esperanza with talking about NECAN, basically. I think that the relationships have been greatly built over the last 3 or 4 years throughout the Northeast on basically project-based on ocean acidification monitoring and things like that. As far as legislatively, we have a management and policy group within NECAN, working group that's been broadening that discussion within various entities in the Northeast.
And this is Avalon Bristow, co-coordinator of MACAN, and I just wanted to echo that sentiment that MACAN is also kind of following the lead of NECAN in a lot of ways and standing up for working groups in a similar structure to NECAN. There was an email that went out to the MACAN listserv earlier in the week, which described those actually 3 of the 4 working groups in detail. So if you're interested in that, please don't hesitate to send me an email.
And I just want to add here, the Gulf of Maine Council on the Marine Environment, which is participating states and Eastern Canadian provinces in the Gulf of Maine, which is an entity that was formed also out of New England Governors and Eastern Canadian Premiers group that has passed many resolutions over the many decades on climate change, including developing a regional climate change action plan and work on adaptation as well. But the Gulf of Maine Council on the Marine Environment just held its 2050 International Symposium in November of last year and included ocean acidification and warming ocean temperatures, sea level rise as major themes, including developing some scenario papers for that. It was a week-long symposium, and so there's quite a bit of regional collaboration there. And I just add to what Esperanza was saying is, on the adaptation side, and I think it applies that we've, found through lessons learned that adaptation, moves forward at the speed of trust, and that's something that we really have done, I think, quite well in building our relationships. So we're sort of ready to utilize those more now.
Okay, we have time for one more question here. If anybody has any other questions that we're not able to get to, feel free to email the speakers whose emails are on the screen now. But our last question open to everyone is, do you know of any existing easy to digest materials for the public that sum up how ocean acidification happens and what can be done about it to help raise awareness?
I mean, I think NOAA has a lot of great resources. Source is one of their great websites and offerings. I would also point out that NECAN has a wealth of resources, from webinars to actual documents that are sort of easy to digest on their web pages.
Esperanza, can we add in the video that was also?
Oh yes. There's a great video that's on our Maine Sea Grant website. It was started by Maine Sea Grant and included NECAN and others to develop the O-Chang video, Acid in the Gulf, and I highly recommend it for people who want to have a digestible and partly humorous way of approaching it.
This is Jessie. I would just add, we've done a couple webinars focused on different communications products that different members have put together for all sorts of audiences, whether they're school like curricula or for industry leaders or for policymakers. And so maybe we can link those to this webinar recording later. But I'd also just really want to compliment MACAN and NECAN's website and some of the products that they put out just very recently describing ocean acidification, ocean and coastal acidification, I think they're just fantastic. So just a huge compliment and underscore how amazing those new products really are.
Well, thank you, everybody. Yeah, just to echo what Jesse said, MACAN has a resources page with some really nice infographics that were developed in partnership with the Sea Grant and NOAA VOCAL program, which is the Visualizing Ocean and Coastal Acidification Locally. There's some really nice infographics on there if folks are interested in taking a look. And there's also links to NOAA's Coastal Acidification Animation tool on the MACAN resources page. And with that, we did have a few more questions that we did not get to answer today. So as Anthony mentioned, please feel free to send any of these folks listed on the screen an email if you have specific questions for them. And we thank you all for your time today and hope to see you on May 28th at our final webinar in this series. Thanks very much. Stay healthy, everyone.
Thank you, Avalon.
Thank you.